The funeral service had just ended, and people were filing out of St. Mary's Cathedral into the gray October afternoon. I stood beside Dad's casket, accepting condolences from family and friends, when my Uncle Robert approached me with that familiar smirk I'd grown to despise over the years. "Alexandra," he said in a low voice, placing his hand on my shoulder with fake sympathy. "I need to speak with you privately about your father's affairs." I followed him to a quiet corner of the church, where my cousins Bradley and Jennifer were waiting with their lawyer, a thin man named Harrison Webb. Uncle Robert cleared his throat and glanced around to make sure no one else could hear. "Alexandra, I know this is difficult timing, but we need to discuss the will. Your father made some significant changes in his final months." "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I already suspected what was coming. I'd noticed the family meetings I wasn't invited to, the hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. "Well," Robert continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "your father was very concerned about your lifestyle choices. The fact that you're still unmarried at 32, no children, living in that small apartment downtown, working at some little nonprofit organization. He felt," Jennifer added with false concern, "that you weren't ready for the responsibility of managing substantial family assets. You know how practical Uncle William always was about business matters." Bradley nodded solemnly. "Dad and I spent a lot of time talking with Uncle William about this. We tried to explain that managing a multi-million-dollar estate requires real business experience, not just good intentions." The lawyer stepped forward with a manila folder. "Ms. Harrison, I'm afraid the will explicitly excludes you from the estate. All assets, the house on Elm Street, Harrison Manufacturing, the investment portfolio, even the family cabin in Colorado, everything transfers to your cousins. Your father felt they were better equipped to handle the family legacy." Webb opened the folder and showed me a document with Dad's signature. "As you can see, this will was executed 3 months ago, witnessed and notarized according to state law. Your father was very clear about his intentions." I stared at the document, recognizing Dad's handwriting but noting how weak and shaky his signature looked. 3 months ago he'd been heavily medicated for pain, barely able to stay awake for more than a few hours at a time. "I see," I said quietly. "And when exactly was this will prepared?" "July 15th, Webb replied. "Your father called my office and requested an emergency appointment. He said he'd been thinking about family responsibilities and wanted to make changes." Uncle Robert put on his most sympathetic expression. "Alexandra, I know this is hard to hear, especially today, but your father wanted what was best for the family business. Bradley has his MBA from Northwestern. Jennifer has her finance degree from University of Chicago. They understand complex business operations in a way that working at a children's charity simply doesn't prepare you for." "We're not trying to be cruel," Jennifer added. "It's just that managing a $50 million estate requires sophisticated financial knowledge. Uncle William was worried that without proper business training, the assets could be mismanaged or lost entirely." Bradley stepped forward condescendingly. "Alexandra, we want you to know that we'll take care of you. Once we get everything settled, we can set up a small trust fund for you. Maybe $50,000 to help with your living expenses." "After all," Uncle Robert continued, "family takes care of family. We're not going to leave you with nothing. But the bulk of the estate needs to be managed by people who understand business, investments, corporate strategy." I nodded sadly and pulled out my phone. "If you'll excuse me for just one moment, I need to make a quick call." I stepped a few feet away and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Hello, Marcus? Yes, it's Alexandra. I need you to execute Protocol 7 immediately." I paused, glancing back at my family members. "Transfer all assets from the Harrison Family Trust to the Alexandra Harrison Charitable Foundation." "Yes, all of them. The full $180 million. I could hear Marcus typing on his computer. "Are you sure about this, Ms. Harrison? Once I execute this transfer, it's irreversible." "I'm absolutely certain. My father always said the money should go where it can do the most good." "Understood. The transaction is complete." When I turned back around, my uncle's face had gone completely white. "What did you just do?" Robert whispered. "I transferred Dad's assets to my charitable foundation," I replied calmly. "All $180 million of them." The lawyer looked confused. "I'm sorry, but that's impossible. The assets belong to the estate, and according to the will, According to the will, I interrupted, the assets that Dad owned at the time of his death go to Bradley and Jennifer. But Dad didn't own any assets when he died. Bradley's face was turning red. What are you talking about? Of course he owned assets. The business alone is worth $50 million. I smiled for the first time since Dad's diagnosis. 5 years ago, Dad transferred everything, the house, the business, all his investments into the Harrison Family Trust. I'm the sole trustee and beneficiary of that trust. Uncle Robert was starting to understand and the color was draining from his face. That's impossible. William would have told us. Why would he tell you? It was a private estate planning decision between a father and his daughter. I pulled out a document from my purse, the trust agreement I'd been carrying since Dad's death. Harrison Family Trust, established January 15, 2019. Sole trustee and beneficiary, Alexandra Harrison. Total assets, $180 million as of this morning. Webb grabbed the document and started reading frantically. This is legitimate, he stammered. Notarized, witnessed, properly executed. But the will. Bradley started. The will leaves you everything that Dad owned at the time of his death, I explained. Unfortunately for you, that amounts to about $3,000 in his personal checking account and his 1998 Honda Civic. Uncle Robert was shaking now. Alexandra, you can't do this. That money belongs to the family. You're right, I agreed. It belongs to family. It belongs to the daughter who spent every weekend for the past 5 years helping Dad with the business. The daughter who moved back home when he got sick. The daughter who held his hand every night in the hospital for the past 3 months. But we're family too. Jennifer protested. Really? When was the last time any of you visited Dad? Before today, I mean. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. I'll tell you when, I continued. Bradley, you last saw Dad at Christmas, where you spent the entire dinner talking about your new BMW. Jennifer, you last visited in March when you needed him to co-sign a loan for your condo. And Uncle Robert, you last spoke to Dad 6 months ago when you called asking if he'd invest in your friend's restaurant. That's not fair, Robert said weakly. What's not fair is spending the last 3 months of his life telling him his daughter was a disappointment while planning how to divide up his assets the moment he died. Marcus Chin, my financial advisor and the executor of the trust, had arrived at the church during our conversation. He was a small, efficient man who had helped Dad structure his estate planning 5 years earlier. Ms. Harrison, Marcus said, approaching our group. I've executed the transfer as requested. All assets from the Harrison Family Trust have been moved to the Alexandra Harrison Charitable Foundation. The transition is complete. Uncle Robert turned to Marcus desperately. This is fraud. She's stealing money that belongs to the family. Marcus pulled out his briefcase. Sir, I handled Mr. William Harrison's estate planning personally. 5 years ago he explicitly transferred all assets to the trust specifically to avoid probate and ensure his daughter would inherit everything immediately upon his death. But why? Bradley asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Why would Uncle William do that? Marcus looked at me and I nodded for him to continue. Mr. Harrison was very concerned about certain family members' attitudes toward his daughter. He'd overheard several conversations where family members suggested she wasn't capable of handling business responsibilities due to her career choices. He also kept records of family interactions. He was particularly troubled by comments made at family gatherings about his daughter's unmarried status, her living situation, and her professional choices. He was spying on us? Jennifer asked. He was listening to you, I corrected. At every family gathering for the past 5 years, you and Bradley would openly discuss how you'd modernize the business once you inherited it. You talked about selling the house, liquidating investments, and restructuring operations to maximize profits. We were just brainstorming, Bradley protested. You were planning Dad's funeral before he was dead. You talked about firing longtime employees and selling off what you called sentimental assets. Marcus nodded. Mr. Harrison was particularly upset by a conversation he overheard last Thanksgiving, where you discussed selling the company regardless of what happened to the 400 employees. Those people would have found other jobs, Jennifer said defensively. Those people include families who have worked for Harrison Manufacturing for decades. People like Margaret Collins, who started as Dad's secretary and is now chief operating officer. People like James Morrison, who worked his way up from the factory floor and has 3 kids in college. Business is business, Bradley said weakly. That's exactly what Dad was afraid of. He didn't want his life's work reduced to a balance sheet. The lawyer cleared his throat nervously. Ms. Harrison, surely we can work out some arrangement. Your cousins have legitimate expectations. Based on what? Based on the assumption that they could treat Dad and me poorly for years and still collect a multi-million-dollar inheritance. We never treated anyone poorly, Robert said. Uncle Robert, when Dad had his first heart attack 2 years ago, where were you? I had business commitments. You were in Las Vegas. For a week. While Dad was in intensive care, you were gambling. Mom called you 6 times. And Jennifer, when Dad needed someone to drive him to chemotherapy, what did you say? Jennifer stared at her shoes. I said I was too busy with work. You said you couldn't be around sick people because it depressed you. And Bradley, when Dad asked you to help him understand the new computer systems at the factory, what was your response? Bradley's voice was barely a whisper. I said I didn't have time to teach an old man new tricks. The weight of their past behavior was settling on them. For the first time, they were seeing their actions through Dad's eyes. We'll contest this in court, Jennifer declared, though her voice shook. Marcus spoke up. Miss Jennifer, the trust was established 5 years ago when Mr. Harrison was in perfect health. He had full legal capacity, independent legal counsel, and medical documentation. Additionally, the trust has been operational for 5 years. There are no grounds for contest. Besides, I added, contesting would require expensive litigation. Do any of you have the resources for a multi-year legal battle against $180 million in assets? The silence told me everything about their financial situations. Dad had known exactly what he was doing. He'd watched his brother and nephews spend money they didn't have, assuming they'd eventually inherit his wealth. He'd seen them treat me like a failure because I chose non-profit work over corporate success. What they didn't know was that my little non-profit job was actually as executive director of the largest children's charity in the state, with an annual budget of $25 million. I had an MBA from Wharton and 15 years of experience managing complex organizations. Dad knew exactly how capable I was. There's something else you should know, I said. Dad's business has been struggling for the past 2 years. The industry changed, competitors moved in, and Dad was too sick to adapt quickly enough. Bradley perked up. So, we can turn it around. Actually, you can't. Because 6 months ago I orchestrated a merger with Pinnacle Industries. Harrison Manufacturing no longer exists as an independent company. Uncle Robert's eyes widened. You sold the family business? I saved the family business. Dad was looking at bankruptcy within 18 months. The merger preserved 350 of the 400 jobs and generated $30 million in cash, which is now part of the trust assets. Marcus nodded. The merger was Ms. Harrison's idea, but Mr. Harrison approved every detail. She spent months analyzing the company's position and negotiating terms that would preserve jobs. You had no right. Jennifer screamed. I had every right. As trustee, I'm responsible for preserving assets. Dad asked me to handle the merger because he was too weak to manage it himself. So let me understand, the lawyer said slowly. The business that was supposedly being left to your cousins was actually sold 6 months ago? Merged. And yes, the proceeds are part of the trust assets that have now been transferred to my foundation. Bradley was starting to understand. So we get nothing? You get exactly what Dad wanted you to have. The same consideration you showed him.
Uncle Robert made one last desperate attempt. Alexandra, be reasonable. We're family. Surely there's something we can work out. I looked at these people who had spent years treating me like a disappointment, who had excluded me from family discussions, who had planned Dad's estate while he was still alive. You're right. We are family. And family should look out for each other. Hope flickered in their eyes. That's why I'm offering each of you a job at the Alexandra Harrison Charitable Foundation. Entry-level positions. Bradley, you can work in accounting. Jennifer, we have an opening in donor relations. The pay is $35,000 per year to start. The horror on their faces was almost comical. You're offering us jobs? Jennifer sputtered. We have graduate degrees. And now you'll have the opportunity to use them in meaningful work helping disadvantaged children. Dad always said that true success comes from service to others. This is ridiculous, Bradley said. We're not going to work for you. That's your choice. But those job offers represent the only inheritance you'll be receiving from Dad's estate. Marcus checked his watch. Miss Harrison, we should head to the reception. People are expecting you. I turned to leave, then stopped. By the way, the house on Elm Street? Dad transferred that to the trust 3 years ago. Uncle Robert, you have 30 days to find new arrangements. Uncle Robert had been living rent-free in Dad's house for 2 years. You can't throw us out, he protested. You're welcome to apply to rent the property at market rate, which is $4,500 per month. As Marcus and I walked toward the reception, I could hear them arguing frantically behind us. You handled that well, Marcus said quietly. Your father would be proud. I hope so. I've been dreading this conversation for months. He knew they'd react this way. That's why he wanted the trust structured to protect you from challenges. The reception was being held at the Riverside Country Club, which Dad had also quietly transferred to the trust. As I moved through the crowd, accepting condolences and sharing memories, I reflected on the conversation that had started all of this 5 years ago. Dad had called me into his office and closed the door. Alexandra, I need to ask you something important. Do you want to inherit my business and assets? I'd been surprised by the directness. Dad, I hope you're planning to be around for a long time. I am, but I'm also a realist. I'm 68, I've had 2 heart attacks, and I need to plan for the future. So I'm asking, do you want to be responsible for everything I've built? I'd thought about it seriously. I'd be honored. It won't be easy. The business needs someone smart and dedicated to guide it through changing times. My brother and his kids think it's just a money machine, but it's 400 people's livelihoods. I understand the responsibility. And there's something else. If I leave everything to you in a traditional will, they'll contest it. They'll claim you manipulated me, or that I wasn't in my right mind, or that you're not capable because you work in nonprofit. So what do you suggest? We set up a trust. Transfer everything now, while I'm healthy and sharp. You become the trustee and beneficiary. When I die, there's nothing to contest because you'll already own everything. Dad, are you sure? That's a lot of trust to place in someone. He'd smiled. Alexandra, you're the only person in this family who never asked me for money. You're the only one who chose a career based on helping others. You're the only one who visits me because you want to spend time with me, not because you need something. But Uncle Robert and the cousins will inherit exactly what they deserve based on how they've treated me and this family. Now, 5 years later, Dad's plan had worked perfectly. The trust had protected his assets, ensured his wishes were carried out, and prevented the family fighting that would have destroyed everything he'd built. 3 hours later, as the reception was winding down, Uncle Robert approached me one final time. Alexandra, I want to apologize for how we handled things today. We were upset and said things we didn't mean. I appreciate that, Uncle Robert. I've been thinking about your job offer. Maybe it would be good for Bradley and Jennifer to learn about charitable work. I smiled. The positions are still available if they're genuinely interested. And the house on Elm Street, perhaps we could work out some arrangement? Market rate rent, 1-year lease, first and last month due at signing. If you're interested, have your attorney contact Marcus. Robert nodded reluctantly. I suppose we don't have much choice. Uncle Robert, you always have choices. Dad made his choices based on how people treated him. I'm making mine the same way. 6 months later, the transformation had been remarkable. Bradley had taken the accounting position and discovered a genuine aptitude for nonprofit financial management. Jennifer had started reluctantly in donor relations but gradually began to understand the satisfaction that comes from connecting donors with meaningful causes. Uncle Robert had surprised everyone by approaching the facilities management position with unexpected diligence. Perhaps because he'd finally found work that produced tangible results, he'd discovered a sense of purpose that had been missing. None of them had become wealthy from Dad's death, but they'd all learned something more valuable, that true worth comes from what you contribute, not what you inherit. They'd learned that success isn't measured only in dollars, but in the positive impact you have on other people's lives. Dad would have been proud of that lesson too. In fact, as I read through his private journals after the funeral, I discovered that teaching that lesson had been part of his plan all along. He'd known that forcing them to work for their money would either reveal their true character or help them develop better character. Either way, his legacy would continue in the form of a charitable foundation that would help thousands of children, managed by family members who had finally learned the difference between earning respect and demanding it. The Harrison name would live on, but now it would be associated with service and generosity, exactly the legacy Dad had always hoped to leave behind.